Здравствуйте. Hello, and good afternoon. My name is Jake Brower, and I am a Senior Engineering Manager in Quality. I'm also a Certified Scrum Master and Certified Agile Facilitator. I work for a company called Credit Karma in San Francisco, where we champion financial progress for everyone. We have over 90 million members in the United States. We also just moved into Canada, and we will be moving elsewhere throughout the world. I'm going to talk about the Quality Scorecard today. Before I get too much into it, I want to give you a little bit of background on who I am. I've actually been in QA for 25 years. This is my 25th year. I started off in 1994, where I actually taught myself HTML, and I started going to local nonprofit companies and helped build websites so they could get a web presence. Now, building these websites, I also had to test them at the same time, but I didn't really know what I was doing, but I found that I really enjoyed it. So a friend of mine said, well, why don't you go get a job in QA if that's something that you really enjoy? So I did. The first thing I was doing was testing AS400 mainframe systems, if anybody's familiar with that. Yes, it's very old technology. It's still in existence today. I worked at various companies, also testing commercial off-the-shelf software, desktop apps, etc. And then also very early mobile devices and apps toward the later part of 2005 and 2006. And then team leadership. I kind of rose up through the ranks. I was a QA engineer. I became a team lead. Then I also became a manager of the same team that I was a QA engineer on. From 2006 to the present, I've been in people management. So it's about 13 years that I've managed people. I adore managing people. It's one of my favorite things. I've also done company-wide transformations that focus on pushing quality as far left as possible. Hopefully that's something familiar with you all. Company re-engineering and process engineering, building world-class teams, and then utilizing metrics to help teams focus on their development processes. So that's where my talk is going to focus today, is metrics. I know it's something. Metrics is a word that people know that they have to do. They know they have to do metrics, but they don't really know how. So we as a company tackle this. But first, we had a few problems that we were trying to solve. The first one is that we didn't have any consistent way to measure quality for our teams. We knew people were using Jira, which is what we use in-house, but aside from building a Jira dashboard, we really didn't have any semblance of each team, how they are actually going about quality. What are some of their quality KPIs? We didn't have a set of quality KPIs to help us with our engineering objectives. So again, because we didn't know really what the status of any given team was we didn't know how to do process improvements. We needed to start somewhere. We didn't have a way to quickly visualize the quality level for each team. So again, we can look at a Jira dashboard, but that's so static. It doesn't really give you a whole lot of information that you can use to drive process improvements forward. We didn't have a way to identify quality issues earlier. So we have issues, we know we have issues, but we don't know how to take these issues and turn them into process improvements moving forward. We didn't have a system to present these metrics in an automated fashion. So we can build something, we can buy something off the shelf, but we have to do it in an automated way to eliminate the subjectivity. We have to make it as objective as possible. So what is a quality scorecard? I know this is probably a new concept for most of you. It was for us as well. So we define the scorecard as a performance measurement framework, where we want to facilitate effective and consistent communication across all teams. We wanted everyone to speak the same language. And metrics are a language that people are kind of uncomfortable with because they know it's something they have to do, but again, they don't have the tools necessary to do so. But we wanted to make sure the entire engineering organization was aligned, so we had to teach everyone these concepts, this language. We want to use quality KPIs to focus for improvements. As I said, if you have metrics but they're not meaningful, they're not actionable, then what's the point of having metrics in the first place? So we have to have them drive process improvements for each engineering team. Enabling frequent reviews to ensure consistent practices. Again, if you build a tool, that's great. If you're using a tool, that's great. If you only use it once or once a year, what's the point? So it has to be something that's done on a regular basis, so it's always at the top of mind. And then ensuring organizational alignment. Again, all engineering teams have to kind of be able to speak the same language, so we can be aligned on what these metrics are. So what I want to talk about today is our journey. The journey to V1. You can see my little dot there, that's the very beginning. The very first step we did was define the requirements with engineering leadership and getting buy-in. So I basically sat in a room with engineering leaders and said, here's what we want to do, whether it's something that we're going to buy off the shelf or whether it's something we're going to build in-house. Here is what we need to do. What are we looking for this tool to do? What are the requirements that you're looking for as engineering leaders? This took a little while because, again, people are trying to wrap their heads around KPIs, quality, all that kind of stuff. So there was lots of conversations, lots of deep dives for people to really understand what is effective for them and what they can use for their teams to drive process improvements forward. Ultimately, we got buy-in. It took about a month or so for people to really come on board to understand how this is going to be meaningful for them and their teams. The next step was researching COTS options. COTS is commercial off the shelf that might match our requirements. We spent a good 4 to 6 weeks looking at products that are out there. So taking the list of requirements that we had, looking at the products that were out there, ultimately deciding, is there a product out there that actually fulfills our requirements? We found that there wasn't really a tool to do so. Most of them required a lot of configuration. They were hundreds of thousands of dollars. They weren't as flexible as what we were looking for. So based on all of this information, all this research, we had to decide on the best path forward. And as I mentioned, these products off the shelf, they just weren't what we were looking for. So what we decided to do was build it in-house. This was really cool because it would give us the flexibility that we needed. It would also fulfill every single requirement that we had. And we wouldn't have to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to do so. Next, we had to document the architecture, but before we did that, we had to go out and find a developer with a QA mindset to build this thing. So we searched for a person. We ultimately hired a senior QA engineer who had a deep development background, and she was hired, and this was the first project that she was put on at Credit Karma, and she spent about 50% of her time for 8 months to build this. So if you imagine, if it was 100% of her time, it would probably take her 4 months, but this took about 8 months to build. So what she had to do is document the architecture and decide on the technology. The good thing is that we were going to be using a lot of the same technologies that we already had in-house. So it didn't really require a whole lot of a new technology or a new architecture. Building out a prototype. So before we built any type of front end, any type of visualization that somebody was going to do, I actually took the point to create a prototype. Believe it or not, I created it in Google Sheets. Google Sheets is a fantastic tool. I love Google Sheets. I'm a master at it. It's just something I use it every single day. I see lots of nods here. It is something that completely, it's something I use all the time. So I built out a prototype, a working prototype with all the KPIs, all the functions. It had different sheets, it calls to different sheets, and it actually looked pretty cool. It functioned really, really cool. The nice thing about Google Sheets is you can integrate it with Jira. I'm not sure if you knew that, but there's a plugin you can get. It integrates with Jira in real time, and so you can actually pull down information into a Google spreadsheet. It was pretty slick, but it wasn't a real UI. The next thing we had to do was design a database. So we knew we were going to have to store information. What we wanted to do, the requirement was to store it for a year, because we wanted to be able to go back and look over time to see how engineering teams were doing. So I'll talk about the database in a little bit, but that's the next step here. So from here, we had to actually start designing the front end and the API part of it. I'll talk about the specific technologies in a little bit. This part, the little dots actually represent kind of a time element. So as you can see, there's a lot of time between designing the database and the front end. It took a lot of work. we were basically taking all the commercial off-the-shelf software, all the products that we found, and we were going to basically mimic them and turn them into a product for our own internal use. So as you can imagine, there was lots of development there. And lots of testing. Now, along the way, we solicited feedback from engineering leadership. We didn't want to be this kind of waterfall, big bang approach where we built something and then all of a sudden people have input at the very end. That's not how we operated here. We didn't do this as Scrum or anything like that, but we wanted to obtain feedback along the way to make sure that we were building the right tool for the right thing. Ultimately, it's a metrics tool, but again, we wanted to make sure that engineering leadership was signing off at kind of each step of the phase, or each step of the process. It's really important to have engineering leadership on board. Next, we had to build out the actual test and production environments for this thing. The test environment, so we put it on a UAT, essentially, that's the next phase. We're going to put it on a UAT, user acceptance testing environment. We had to build out a production environment because we wanted to host this ourselves. We didn't want it to be mutable. We didn't want it to have to go away after a couple of months. We wanted to build a server that this was going to live on. And then we hooked up the database. So then we deployed to a UAT. We did lots of testing here. This is where we also got engineering leadership involved because we wanted to make sure that we were addressing some of the UI issues that we knew would actually happen. The prototype is only good as Google Sheets, so once we actually put it onto a UAT, we knew we were going to have much different issues. The last thing we did was, after building all of this, testing all of this, putting it into the right environments, we had to communicate to engineering. So not only the engineering leadership, but this is everyone in engineering now. So we sent out emails, mass emails, we had workshops, we had one-on-ones with people so they could understand the scorecard and what it meant for them and their team. Let's talk about the technology a little bit. Now, my role in this was really the program manager. I wasn't really doing any developing at all. I built out the prototype, but I was managing the development of it, the person who was doing development. The technology is pretty simple. We're a Ruby shop. So we use Ruby pretty much all throughout Credit Karma. So we built this in Sinatra, which is Ruby. It has HTML and CSS wrapped around it. It's pretty simple, but not really. So the API and the backend part of it, we knew that we wanted to build the facility to be able to go out through the API or go through various APIs to collect information, whether it was from Jira or TestRail, whatever. We knew we had to build that into this in an automatic way. So we have a Postgres database that stores a year's worth of data. We chose Postgres because it was something that we already had in-house. We looked at different options for database, but because we use Postgres in a much larger way at Credit Karma, we decided to use the same technology because it fulfilled all the requirements that we were looking for. This is how the refresh works. So, as you can see on the left-hand side, these are some of the technologies, or some of the applications that we use. So every night, it goes through the APIs, it collects the metrics through these various applications. It stores that data into the database. Again, this is once a night. Every morning at 1 a.m., the scorecard then goes and pulls the information from the database. It applies all the math and scoring logic needed, and then it outputs it to the front end. I know it's really small, but I'll have a bigger version in just a second. It outputs it to the front end. This happened once a day. One of the things that we had to do was try to figure out, what does the scorecard look like from a time element? Is it going to be a snapshot in time? Is it going to be by day? Is it going to be by month? What does it look like? So what we decided is to do a rolling 30 days, because a rolling 30 days gave us a really good understanding of how a team would be doing within those 30 days. So a week was not enough. A day was not enough, but a month seemed to be good. So every day, it's a snapshot in time for the last 30 days. So here it is. This is the actual quality scorecard that we use in-house. I see phones going up, so I'll give it a second. I'm going to talk about each one of these elements in here. So this took 8 months to build. It's extremely complex on the back end. I can't express how complex it is. The front end looks like any other front end. So let's talk about it. I've redacted some stuff that's company specific. So we have 5 dimensions here. Now we chose these dimensions based on talking to engineering leaders. We wanted to present what was most important to the company. So we call these dimensions. The next one is a dimension score. So you see at the top left in the black box, every dimension has a score, and that's all the KPIs in that dimension, they are rolled up into a score. Now, these are KPIs, or key performance indicators. As you can see, some of these dimensions have a lot, some of them have very few. We've had KPIs come and go because they didn't make sense anymore, or they just weren't pulling the right kind of data. So we had to make this as flexible as possible so we could put in new teams. Because the way this works is this actually shows by team. You see the team in the upper left. So every team can go in and look at their own scorecard, or they can look at the scorecard from fellow teams to see how they're stacking up. So each KPI itself has a score. Now, if you see red here, that means it isn't meeting the target. So we wanted to make sure that if they were all in black, everything looks good, nobody's going to pay attention to the scorecard. So we had to make sure that people saw something that they needed to take action on. So that's why if it doesn't meet a predetermined threshold, again, these thresholds were set early on in the requirements phase. If it didn't meet that threshold, we had to turn it a different color. So that means your eye goes right to these reds, right? So that's what we wanted for the teams as well. They should hone in on those red areas. We also created this really cool little tool. It's a little pop-up. So when you hover over a KPI, I wish I could do this live, but I can't. If you hover over it, it actually gives you the target. And when you click on the KPI, it gives you this little pop-up, which gives you more information about how it's being calculated, how it's being weighted, et cetera. And it also gives you a link. So you see there's a Jira dashboard link. It actually takes you to the query. So if you're a team and you're looking to understand what's behind the scores, you can open up the Jira query and you can kind of go through it there. It actually is a really helpful link. Let's talk about each one of these individually. The first one is the SDLC. Now this is very specific to Credit Karma. SDLC, this essentially measures how compliant we are at approving epics. So in our company, we are FTC regulated. I'm not going to go into what FTC means, but we have to be compliant with the government, essentially. So this actually shows how compliant teams are. We have to get to 100%. As you can see, this particular team, there's 3 in the red, which means we're not compliant. What we're looking for is that every epic that we have is considered a feature. And when the feature development is done, when the testing is done, you have to have sign-off from legal, you have to have sign-off from security, from QE or QA. So we have to get to 100%. That's what we're looking for here. This data is being pulled directly through Jira. Coverage. So with this dimension, we are using a homegrown tool to go out and look at GitHub. Does anybody use GitHub? All right. So we built a tool because we wanted to understand how people are using their repos against, I think we have about 15 rubrics. So these are measures for your front-end repos and your back-end repos. This is an incredibly powerful tool because we wanted to make sure teams were following best practices while using GitHub. So some of these best practices I listed here: do you have a README file? Do you have approvers? Do you have your default branch protected, et cetera? These are rubrics that we have defined as best practices for GitHub. Now, this, as the name implies for this dimension, coverage, this could also be things like automation coverage, code coverage, et cetera. We put a couple of other KPIs in here related to test coverage, but there is no single tool at Credit Karma for code coverage. So we're actually building one in-house, which is pretty cool. So we'll also be using this dimension for other things as well. Automation coverage. Has anybody used TestRail? Okay, TestRail is not a good application, especially when you're talking about the API. It's so difficult to pull information through the API. So we decided to drop that for right now. This, as I mentioned, this data is being pulled directly from GitHub. So with pre-production, as the name implies, with this dimension, we're measuring teams' ability to find blocker and major defects before production. Now, a lot of these measures they might be familiar to you, and some of these are very industry-based KPIs, which is great. So with the first one, the percentage of P0 and P1 pre-prod bugs. Now, we define P0 as a blocker. There's a crash, there's no workaround, you are stuck. A P1 is considered major. There may be an actual workaround in place. It's still an issue that does need to be fixed. So with the first one, we're doing a measurement. So how many majors and blockers do we have against all the other defects in the last 30 days? That's where that percentage comes from. The second one is, the second and third one, we want to look at the backlog. Since we're a mobile-first company, we wanted to see what the native aspect looked like, because it's very important for us to understand those. So again, for the backlog, we're looking for the percentage of majors and blockers in the native backlog, and then also in the non-native backlog. So anything, obviously, that's non-native. The last one is an industry-standard quality metric, defect removal efficiency. Has anybody heard of that? DRE? Okay. The common definition of defect removal efficiency, or DRE, is what is how good are you at resolving defects before production? So everything that's in pre-production, you might have a whole bunch of defects. How good are you at resolving these? What's your velocity, essentially, in resolving these before production? This data is also being pulled through Jira automatically. Production. As the name implies, this is anything that's not pre-production. With this, we're not measuring a percentage. We don't care about how many blockers and majors versus all the other bugs. We want a number. Because we care. If you have one blocker in production, then we want to know about that one blocker, because it could be something catastrophic. So here we're looking just for a raw number. But because, again, with pre-production, we are a mobile-first company, we want to see what the native versus non-native looks like. The last one up here is P0 and P1 security issues. We have a Jira query that was written by our security team that goes out and looks for vulnerabilities. So if a particular team or a feature for that team has a vulnerability in it, we want to know. So that particular Jira query goes out and looks for all these vulnerability tickets that are out there for a particular team. Obviously, we want that one to be 0. We want all of these to be 0. This particular team had 5 non-native P0, P1 bugs, so that's very bad. They get a slap on the hand. This is being pulled directly through Jira as well. And the last one is platform. So it's good to have bug defects, but we also wanted to have defects from the platform side of the house, or the site operations side of the house. This isn't product engineering. It's not related to defects specifically around the product. These are related to platform. So the first one is Site Operations Operational Excellence Scorecard. So our site operations team, they have their own scorecard. It's in Google Sheets. So we keep telling them we can give them this scorecard so they can actually implement this. But they have it in Google Sheets. So we pull this directly from Google Sheets. So they can get a score from 0 to 3, 3 being obviously the best you can do against all the best practices that are out there from a site operations standpoint or a platform standpoint. The next one is CMM, Capability Maturity Model. Is anybody aware of that? Hopefully. So that's a measure of maturity for any given team based on industry standards around software development. This particular team got a 3. So we have a team that goes out and evaluates all the different teams within Credit Karma. And based on their evaluation, they get a score, a capability maturity model score. We want to strive for 3. The next one is release merge requests. This is an interesting one because I know most companies have this. So we're rushing to we're getting ready to deploy a build out into production. A developer comes in and says, oh, I have this last thing, I really need to get in there. Everything's already been set, ready to go into deploy, but this developer, we have to go through a process in order to get that thing, whatever it is, whether it's a feature fix or whether it's a bug or a bug fix or something like that. We want to know which developers are doing that because it's not good practice to do something like that at the very last minute, as you all know. The next 2 are actually being pulled through PagerDuty. We do PagerDuty 24 hours a day, so we want to, if anything happens with our website or our applications, we want to know what's happening. So, number of high urgency incidents, this is a PagerDuty metric. So for any given team, what kind of incidents have they seen from, for that particular team? So this team had 63 incidents in the last 30 days. That's not very good. The last one is the mean time to resolve. So if you take all 63 of those, the average time to resolve them is 122 minutes. Again, that's not very good. That's why these are in red. Obviously, we want these to be 0. This is being pulled through PagerDuty. The last 2 are being pulled through PagerDuty. All right, let's talk about weighting and scoring. Because not all KPIs or metrics are the same. They don't have the same impact. Obviously, if you see a security issue, that's a much higher impact than something else. So we have to weight them accordingly. The scoring is based on a 4.0 school scale. I'm not sure if that's different here, but in the United States, that's what we use. Okay, let's talk about adoption. So we built this, everybody's been involved, people have been trained, but then actually using it on a regular basis, that's something that was much harder than building it. It's much harder than just using it. We have to get people used to using it on a day-to-day basis. It's much harder than implementation, we found, because you're changing people's mindset. It's a paradigm shift for people. Now they have to focus on very specific things related to their own team's quality. They have to own it. What we're trying to build here is kind of a self-accountability model, where teams need to be accountable for the quality of their software development lifecycle. Also with adoption, this is something that's ongoing. This has actually been out now for over a year, and it's still something that we have to talk about. We have to talk about adoption with these teams. Having meaningful discussions with your teams, and you're going to create a story around what you see. Adoption must include the scorecard on a regular basis. I can't stress this enough. So again, if you build a tool, people will come, that's great. If they're not using the tool in any way, then what is the point of even having it? And this is part of that paradigm shift that we had to instill in people. The scorecard must help you focus on making improvements. Again, if you're not using it to make improvements within your own team or your own practices around development, what's the point? So we also had this notion of context. So people need to understand very quickly what these KPIs are telling them on any given day. So what we did is we built a separate page on the quality scorecard. So people could come in and look at the scores, and they could actually get a little bit of sense of what it's telling them, because it's not black and white. Some of these things are very gray. As you know, by doing root cause analysis for some things, a lot of things they're not very easy to figure out right from the get-go. So it's the same with metrics. So we created this page. This is just a sample of one of the KPIs that I showed you earlier. So this is for a D, for this particular KPI. I'm not going to read all of that, but here's some of the potential issues around this. Here's why you might be seeing some of these KPIs in the red. So we're giving them some reasoning here. It's not to say that that's all the reasoning, or it may not even be any of this stuff. But the point is they can use this as kind of a springboard to go and do some research. The next one is remediation steps. Okay, so they're armed with some information on what they see. Okay, that's great. It could be it could be something like that, it could be not. Here's some of the remediation steps that they can take. So it's good for them to have the context, but it's also good for them to have some remediation steps. So we give some information so they can actually take action on this right away. Again, it may not be this, it may be this, or it may be something completely different. But we wanted to make sure that there was as much low overhead as possible for these teams, because that was one of the things we talked about in the beginning with requirements. Engineering leaders kept saying, I don't want my teams to spend a whole lot of time on anything related to the scorecard because I've got development to do. And so my role is to make sure that, yes, I know that they have development to do, but you need to do it in the right way. You need to be accountable for the quality that you have, because it's not the QE team. Everybody's responsible for quality at Credit Karma. And I know as the world has changed, it's kind of the same model for QA all over the world now. It's not just the QA team's responsibility. The last thing we did was implement trending. As I mentioned earlier, the database that we had created, we wanted to make it store a year's worth of data, because we wanted to be able to go back a year from now, a year ago, and see what that looked like over time. How are teams doing against their own KPIs? So I chose 2 teams here. These are actual teams data, and I chose 3 KPIs from each of those teams. As you can see, there's one KPI in blue. It's relatively stable, which is good. This is P0, P1 prod bugs, non-native. We want to see 0 there. So this one's 0, that one's really close to 0. It has 1 over time. What we're focused on when looking at trending is the mountains and the valleys. So as you can see here, there's a couple of areas where it shot up or shot down. Well, what's happening in those areas? Was there a release that was happening? Was there a fire? What was actually happening here? So this becomes your conversation piece. This is where you focus your conversations and creating that story about what happened. So if somebody comes and asks you, hey, what happened on this day? Why did your KPI lower or go up? You can actually have that at the ready. This is a very valuable tool for us. So there's kind of 4 phases here that I want to talk about. If you kind of leave here with something today. One is the score. So you're presented with a score. Okay, I have a score. What do I do with that score? The next thing is have a conversation with your team. Okay, as a team, you should be sitting down on a regular basis, whether it's at a retrospective, whether it's during some kind of planning meeting, whether it's even daily stand-ups. Our Credit Karma actually does this. Every team they can do this however they want to. As long as you're having the conversation with your team about what you're seeing, it can help you create a story, which is ultimately what you're trying to get to. You're trying to create that story. So again, if the CTO from your organization looks at your scores, he can actually understand what your story is very quickly without having to go and ask you all these questions. And then ultimately remediation. So again, if you build it, you understand your scores, you've created a story, but if you're not remediating, if you're not taking those steps, then what's the point? And this is something that we have to drive home continuously at Credit Karma. So the main takeaways from this talk, the Quality Scorecard can help drive focus on making improvements in your own SDLC. It has to be that. If you're not making improvements, then you're not really doing anything with your metrics. You're not taking accountability for the metrics that you have for your own team. Choose KPIs that make sense for you to track without much team customization. Metrics, a lot of companies like to create metrics for the sake of metrics, to show that there's some metric around some metrics. That doesn't make any sense. If it's not meaningful to you and your team or your company, or if it's not actionable, they have to be both. If they aren't both of those, then what is the point? Without much team customization, so we at Credit Karma, the requirements that we made encompassed all of our engineering teams. We did have some slight customization for a couple of teams, but from the 99% level, the vast majority, we had to create the same KPIs for all the teams. It makes it flexible, and it keeps it easy to maintain from a code perspective. You don't need resources to make this a reality. As I said, it took half a person 8 months to do this. Now, she has a deep code background in Ruby, so it was obviously helpful, but that's exactly what we hired. We hired her to do this specific thing. Remediating low scores should be easy if done on a regular basis. You have to keep doing this all the time. As I mentioned, each team can kind of do this their own way. In whatever ceremony they see fit, as long as they're doing it on a regular basis. We have some teams who are doing it daily, some teams who are doing it weekly or bi-weekly. It really just depends on your team. So, paldies, spasiba, and thank you.
Questions?
По-русски я смогу, переведите.
Must be Russian. Я не знаю.
Sorry.
It's okay. Should I take this one off?
Yeah, you can.
Раз.
Yes, I can hear you.
Спасибо за презентацию. Скажите, пожалуйста, насколько я понял, у вас получился некий дашборд, который в онлайн-режиме показывает результаты релиза, и на основании его ведется оценка KPI с какой-то периодичностью, всей команде причем. Почему решили разрабатывать собственный продукт? Почему не используя какие-то, может быть, встроенные плагины в Jira или еще какие-то готовые решения?
Okay, so the question was, we built this thing, why didn't we just use something that was out there available? As I mentioned in the earlier part of the talk, there are hundreds of these products out there, but most of these products were so complex, they didn't have the flexibility, they cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, they didn't fulfill most of the requirements that we had that were very specific to our organization. So rather than spending $100,000 on a product that is not going to be used the same way, we can take that money and build it in-house. And so it made more sense to build it in-house.
Спасибо за ответ. Насколько я понял, оценка целесообразности в какой-то перспективе она учитывалась, в том числе на эксплуатацию этого решения с поддержку.
That's correct.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Natalie. Thank you for your presentation. I have a question, as I'm right, it's your own product, yes? So is it free for use for another company, or you are selling it, or how, you are talking a lot about it, and I think it's a really cool one, but how we can use it?
It is not available for purchase. We're very happy where it is right now. We're very happy that we could build something, because I know all of you use metrics or want to use metrics in some way. My presentation was aimed at how you can do it as a company building this. You know, I wish I could go in deeper to the technology and all of that stuff, but as long as you have buy-in from the company, from the higher ups, to dedicate to this particular thing, just build it yourself. I think you're going to get these do they get these presentations afterwards? Do we know? They will?
I have a lot
and
of
we can
photos.
also connect afterwards, if you like. Unfortunately, it's not for sale. Maybe we should make it for sale, but it's just for our company.
Yeah, I think so. And another one, very quickly. What do you think, how, or maybe you have any ideas, how stressful it was to adoption for teams? And because if you can imagine, like people that are working in like an agile environment,
Yes.
it may be stressful for them.
It was a little stressful in the beginning because really people didn't understand what we're trying to do, what we're trying to do with these KPIs. So it was stressful for teams, but I think the more conversations that we had around what we're trying to do and how people can own the quality for their own team, it sort of clicked. after a little while. It took months to do that, but it was stressful in the beginning, but now it's just something that people do on the regular basis because it's at the top of mind. It's not something they have, oh, it's Tuesday, I have to go look at the scorecard now. It's not really a task anymore, whereas before it was a task. So it's much easier now.
Thank you.
Hi, my
Hi.
name is Elena, and I have the questions. You count all for the release. Why you don't count the effect of improvement or the exact number, the effect of improvement?
When you say effort of improvement,
Yes, you have the numbers of this KPI for the team. You count the effect of work, but still you don't count the effect of improvement.
correct. We aren't tracking how long it takes to make an improvement. What we're doing right now, we're still pretty young in this. What we're doing right now is we're tracking over time how teams are doing. The biggest thing that we were seeing for teams was people aren't going into their JIRAs, they're not commenting, there's bugs that are sitting in the backlog for weeks or months. And that's not acceptable. If something is in the backlog, you need to address it, especially if it's a higher priority, if it's a blocker or major. So that's why.
Hi.
Hi.
When you were talking about your journey, you mentioned that at first we need to define the requirements with engineering leadership. But what would you do if they don't have a common ground about these requirements?
So this is where my 25 years in quality come into play. I've been around been around the block a few times. I remember when waterfall was the thing. So it was bringing my knowledge of quality forward to a lot of the development teams who didn't really have that natural ability. So I rely in my past on quality metrics out there in the industry, so I would bring those forward and have those conversations. A lot of this was educating people on what is a KPI, what is quality for that matter. Because even though teams, they know they need to focus on quality, they didn't really understand what that fully meant. So a lot of it was me educating the teams.
Yes, thank you for the presentation. I have one question for one of the KPI,
Yes.
the number of bugs on production. Is it all the bugs, or do you have some category, meaning some bugs are due to change management, due to data issue, or the usage done by a feature?
It can be any type of bug.
So it's all included and affected to the team?
Yeah, for that particular team, we're looking for, that particular metric is the number of blockers and majors. We know that we have plenty of normals. Normals is usually the highest number of bugs, but for that particular metric, we're just looking for blockers and majors. Yeah, we care about all bugs, but because those are the most, have the greatest impact. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks again for the presentation. One of the points was echoing in my soul when we were talking about PNAS connected with the test trail. I was facing the exact same problem. A while ago, we were facing the kind of same challenge when we have to collect the KPIs of the team. So we decided to do some kind of tool to export data from the test trail, but yeah, we actually managed to do that on a C#. But my question is kind of connected with the first one from someone. It's connected to the question, why won't you use some kind of tool that already developed? Because as I've understood, we've faced some kind of similar challenge when you have some kind of the tool like integrator that gathers the data from different services like Jira, TestRail, Google Spreadsheets as well, using its API. And for example, we were using Microsoft Power BI, and on a free license, it allows to do that. So have you considered that?
We did. So there's a few considerations around this. One is, if you think about it in terms of, you have a whole bunch of requirements. You can go find a tool that might fulfill 50% of those requirements. Or you can build a tool that fulfills 100% of those requirements. And there's no fluff. You don't have to worry about configuration. You don't have to worry about upgrades. You don't have to worry about any of that stuff. Because anytime there's a feature change, we just change it in the scorecard, and then there's the new feature. So ultimately, it came down to cost and time and flexibility. So it made it easier for us to make the decision to do it in-house because it fulfilled 100% of our requirements.
Okay, got it. But can you share one of the killer feature of your built-in-house tool?
What type of feature?
I mean, one of, I don't know, the feature that tools that we were considering to use on the market.
Oh gosh, it was 2 years ago. I don't remember which ones we used, which ones we tried, but I think we tried.
No. I mean, what was the most appropriate feature of your tool that you are building that allows you to create it as closer as you can to your specific tasks?
The biggest one was the visualization. So a lot of the off-the-shelf ones, their dashboards were extremely weird. It wasn't a single presentation of KPIs in a stripped-down version. Because what we wanted to do was have a single UI that made sense for everybody. The ones that we were looking at, they had little dashboards all over the place. It wasn't as easy to read. And because we wanted teams to spend not as much time on it, they had to be able to immediately see and not have to interpret what they're seeing on the screen. So having something that was eye-readable from the very first second was our #1 requirement.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Yep.
So can system like that, system of KPIs like that, help us to explain to our product owners and tops necessary of paid technical debt? And if it is, can you provide some examples, please?
For technical debt?
Yes.
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, one thing, we built this tool, but we also had to understand what the information that was being provided to us by looking at these KPIs. We implemented trending so we could actually see over time. Now, I go into the scorecard every single day because I'm the program manager of the scorecard. So I look at trends and see what's happening over time. The one thing I was noticing is that people aren't looking at their JIRAs on a regular basis. A team, if you have a whole bunch of things in your backlog, a couple of teams have more than 1,000 things in their backlog. How do you prioritize something like that? But what I was noticing is that people weren't using JIRA the right way. And so this tool, by providing these KPIs, was a good way for us to tell teams you're not using JIRA in the right way. And here's how you use JIRA in the right way. And once we educated people on how to use JIRA the right way, we saw the numbers go up. Amazing how that actually works.
So the answer is yes.
Yes.
Thank you.
The answer is yes.
Thank you for the talk. I have a question. So, as far as I understood, so you're approaching engineering teams with, okay, so this is my understanding how we're going to challenge, address problems which company-wide. And most probably some of those problems have already been somehow solved. They maybe have some custom dashboards, maybe chatbots about signaling, okay, we have one blockers like waiting for more than like 2 days and so on, so on. So people have to change engineering. As me as a engineering leader, I want to already have some procedure which works fine for solving those problems, and now I have to reinvent those things, reintroduce. So maybe how it's from your side, how you sell it to the whole team to make
sell it
to make the standard, So if you have this kind of pain, we're gonna to sell with this. No matter that you already invest in this solution in your team, in your sandbox, you invested months.
Right.
Yeah, for many months or many years, for example. Yeah?
Right. So the easiest way to sell this to engineering leadership is to show them the data. JIRA has a lot of data in it, but people aren't using JIRA in the right way in many companies. So what we're doing is going and looking at the trends that are being provided by JIRA. Look at the actual data. Because development teams don't really have a whole lot of time to look through JIRA. They just we file bugs, they fix bugs, it goes into a backlog, they might change the status, and then it goes away. So what we're doing is providing the data for them. So, for example, over the last 3 months, we have noticed 400 bugs that have not been resolved in less than a week. If we provide the data for teams, it's much easier for these teams to go, oh wow, this is really an issue for our team. We should get on that and make sure that we update our development practices. If we didn't have the data, which in the beginning, we didn't really have the data. People were like, oh, I don't really know what to do with this. This is overhead for us. That's what my role is, to help provide that data to teams. So that's the number one way, is to providing the data. Real things, real tangible things that people can look at and go, oh, I need to fix this part of the process. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay.
Thank you for your speech. My name is Anton. You know, I believe that your system is working well for your company, but we used to try create something like this, but it wasn't work, and actually we didn't understand why, and because the reasons of bugs could be different, and all these values in your tables are depending on something, and the reasons could be different. My question is about objectivity of the system. What kind of percentage is for your system, and how to increase this? Because if we use system that isn't work objectively, my team will not be happy, and I don't need it.
Okay.
Thank you.
So one of the requirements that we had at the very beginning of this effort was to make it objective. We didn't want to have a metric on there that somebody put on there that says, oh, this is what I think it is. We wanted to make sure that it was objective, and the way that we did that was making it automatic. So if we're pulling information through the various APIs, there's no human intervention or human interpretation whatsoever. It's all objective. There are 2 KPIs in the scorecard that are manually entered, but that's because there's an issue with the API itself. So I have to go and enter those manually. But the other 98% of them, they are all objective. But that was one of the requirements that we had to fulfill. We didn't want people going in and looking at the scorecard saying, I don't know if this applies to me, or that doesn't make any sense for my team. It should make sense for your team, because this is objective. All teams have bugs. All teams have quality. Well, they should have quality. But that was one of the requirements that we had in the beginning, was make it objective.
Последний, можно?
Very quickly, you said that you collect information for 30 days, yes, firstly. And after this, I saw that you are collecting during months. And the main question is, so you collect this information for any period, or for all project, or maybe for year? And if you collect for year, have you show it to avoid too much documentation, too much numbers? How you are collecting? How often are you collecting? And how often is like, okay, we collect information, stop, we need to think about this, about our results.
Okay. So as I mentioned very early on in the discussion, what you see on the scorecard is a look back in 30 days. So every day it's cut. There's a brand new one, but it's a rolling 30 days. So the 30 days falls off. So it is a snapshot in time, but it gives us enough time to actually go and look at trending over the last month.
Are you collecting the information for a period more than 30 days? Like, okay, guys, let's see what is going on the last year, on the last project?
Yeah, so let me pull it up here. So this was only, this is a 30-day look back, but we can go back a year. So we wanted to see, based on the power of going in and resolving your defects, how teams could, over time, how they could actually improve their score. Now, we know the scores are going to go up and down because you have releases produce more bugs, et cetera. So that's why we pay attention to the valleys and the mountains, but we can go back a year, and we can actually see how teams are doing.
Thank you.
The best question was?
Oh my God, the best question?
Maybe you can stand up. Who asked questions?
Who asked questions again? They're all good questions. How do I choose the best question? I'm going to say him, the very first one. Thank you. So thank you again. I highly recommend trying this out. I know it's a lot of effort, but it also pays off after a period of time. And it also saves you a ton of money and a ton of time from having to go out and buy something off the shelf that may not work for you. So, спасибо.